Now, I've got a confession to make. I don't generally enjoy real-time strategy games. There have been a few exceptions over the years, but generally, while I like the combat, I don't generally like the management elements. I want to focus on building weapons of mass destruction, not spend time worrying about the scientific advancement or overly complex resource management for my chosen faction. Now, one of the RTS games I did enjoy growing up though was 1997's Total Annihilation by Cavedog Entertainment. To be fair, there are quite a few reasons why I enjoyed it, but probably the most obvious was the level of simplicity it affords the player from a management perspective. There's no worrying about tech trees, morale, religion, or any of that. All you basically need to focus on is two resources: energy, which is fairly abundant, and metal, which is not very abundant until the late game of the campaign. More on that later. Now, I say campaign because that's what I'll be playing through for this retrospective, but upon its initial release, while it included a campaign, it was probably better known for its multiplayer, which, if you don't mind fiddling around, is still possible to play in modern times. The game is largely identical between the modes, with the campaign almost serving as sort of a giant tutorial for the multiplayer mode. The version of the game we're going to be looking at today is the original PC release. There were two expansions released in 1998, the Core Contingency and Battle Tactics, both of which are included in the Total Annihilation Commander Pack, which was released in 1999 and at present is available to purchase from GOG. Oh, and the game was also released for Mac OS X. However, based on my quick research online, this is not an easy process to get it playable on modern Macs. I'm far from an expert on anything Apple related, but you should certainly check and do your research if you're hunting down this version. Now, generally, if I want to present a video of an older game in widescreen, I need to hunt down a community patch or do some serious tweaking of the game's files, sometimes creating other issues for my capture hardware. But in the case of Total Annihilation, not only did the game work straight out of the box on my Windows 11 desktop, but it offered native widescreen support, which at the time was not common at all. Storytelling in the late 90s was something of a hit and miss affair, but in the case of Total Annihilation, it was a definite hit. Essentially, in the far future, mankind is effectively ruled by a mixture of humans and AI known as the Core. With access to the powerful AI of the Core comes great technological advancements and prosperity, until the Core develops a process to convert someone's consciousness to be transferred into a machine, therefore making them immortal. Now, after a mandate from the Core that all humans are involved in this process and undergo the procedure, there was naturally tension, with some people opting not to follow the mandate and effectively becoming rebels. Later, this conflict would further escalate, with both sides waging war with giant mechanized war machines, therefore plunging the universe into a raging battlefield. Depending on which faction you play as, you can play as either the Core or the Rebels, the Arm. It'll depend on the mission and objectives as well as the ultimate outcome of the campaign. It's actually a really good story, and even though it lacks any real cutscenes, with most of the story moments being delivered by static images and voiceovers, it's actually really well done and conveys the progress of the conflict and the campaign really well. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, please do consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's build a base, churn out some K-bots, and head back to 1997 to remember Total Annihilation. Now, as someone who didn't really like RTS games, Total Annihilation made one critical change that captured my attention. It was approachable. While I'm arguably more patient in adulthood, as a kid, I just wanted to blow things up with minimal fuss, and that's exactly what Total Annihilation offered. At the core of it, no pun intended, Total Annihilation has a fairly simple loop. Build a base, build an army, attack the enemy, complete the objective. There are some variations in terms of the actual objectives as you progress through the respective campaigns. For example, you might need to capture a specific structure or something, but the loop is largely the same whatever the ultimate objective is. Where Total Annihilation differs to other RTSs though, is not only in the approachability, but the overall pacing of the campaign. While the base building mechanics are much simpler than other titles, the game paces these to be even more approachable, while still giving the player the feeling they are progressing and becoming more powerful. There's no greater example of this than the first 3 or 4 missions, which effectively have you complete one simple objective, which can be done with very minimal base building, if any, required. And when you do need to build something, the game locks all of the more advanced items away, meaning you only need to focus on learning 1 or 2 things at a time. Now, this approachability doesn't just apply to base building, it also applies to combat. For example, and I'm oversimplifying this a bit, but for the first 5 or 6 missions, the game gradually introduces you to new combat types. Mission 2 might focus on Cavedog combat. Mission 4 might require you to build ships and therefore a shipyard. Mission 6 might require you to build aircraft, and so on. It's a good system and negates the need for a tutorial as such, instead embedding all of the learning you need into the actual gameplay. Now, I mentioned earlier that you only need to focus on 2 resources, metal and energy. Metal can come from metal deposits, certain items in the environment, and if you are on a core world, the very ground itself. The thing with metal is that no matter how you're collecting it, you never seem to have enough though, and if you deploy metal collectors in areas far away from your base, you run the risk of the enemy easily destroying them. The other resource is energy, which can come from solar, wind, geothermal, or even water-based. Full credit here, for 1997 they were progressively renewable. With a lot more ways to generate energy, it was always far more abundant, and you can actually build items to convert energy to metal, unless it's not overly efficient. The game balances out its use of these resources fairly well, with some items requiring more metal than energy, and vice versa. For example, ships tend to require more metal than energy, but aircraft require more energy than metal. Resources are simplified, but not simple. And this is good because firstly, you don't get bogged down in tech trees, and secondly, because it lets you focus on where the real meat and potatoes of the game are, combat. Now, combat varies dramatically between the units you have available. You basically have infantry, vehicle, sea, which includes submarines, air, and hybrids such as hovercraft. And you also have various stationary defenses for your base, like laser and rocket turrets. Each unit type generally has strengths and weaknesses. For example, aircraft are great at exploring the map rapidly to provide intelligence. However, they're fairly poorly armoured, meaning they won't last long without supporting forces, especially if they encounter any anti-aircraft units. Then you have ships, which can do a good amount of damage to anything within range, but are naturally constrained to the sea, meaning they can easily be picked off by well-placed land-based defences. There's not only a strategic element to combining units of different types, for example, sending K-bots or tanks into a land battle with support from aerial bombers, but a strategy of mixing different type of units within the same class. For example, scout ships are very fast and able to quickly spot enemies but lack any real firepower, whereas destroyers travel much slower but do considerably more damage. All of these units are also supported by your commander, which is in most cases your starting unit, being able to create simple base items and resource collectors in order for those items to then produce more construction items to ramp your base building ability. As well as being able to fabricate structures, the commander is also one of the toughest units in the game, equipped with multiple weapons including a D-gun, which will one-shot most enemies at the cost of a substantial amount of energy. Being the most important unit on the battlefield, if your commander is destroyed, it will almost always result in a large explosion and an immediate mission failure. There's certainly a risk and reward mechanic here. It's always a risk sending your commander far away from your base into the battlefield. However, the ability to one-shot most structures and units is often tempting. Another one of the interesting things the commander can do is capture other units, which, while used for some of the objectives in the game, is actually quite handy in general play, as it saves you the construction cost of the items if you were to build them yourself. Probably the best thing about the overall gameplay is that while the game gives you an objective, it doesn't define how you need to complete it, and you're free to be as creative as you like in achieving it. If you love aircraft, build a fleet of aircraft and bomb the enemy. If you love tanks, build a battalion of tanks and send them into combat. Although, one word of warning, always be aware of the map and its limitations on combat. About halfway through the game, I was placed in a new map with an objective to eliminate all enemy units. Great, I'll start by creating a group of scout tanks and go and seek out the enemy. Only I didn't realise that I was actually on an island, incidentally high in the sky, meaning my tanks couldn't actually leave the island. Now, after I realised this, I changed my approach to aircraft, but there's certainly a lesson in environmental awareness. And environmental awareness doesn't just stop at the map type either. There are items on the map such as trees and valleys which can change the way your units interact and traverse them, with some units being far more adept at crossing areas than others. There's also earthquakes on certain worlds and also fires, with the latter doing substantial damage to any of your units caught within the area. Now, while the gameplay is very good, I did have one thing which served as a frustration throughout the majority of the game. Now, it's far from game-breaking, and I'm probably being slightly harsh for 1997, but it's the AI pathing, in particular your own unit's pathing. There are various ways to group your units, which is par for the course, but the actual control of these units can sometimes be difficult. You can have multiple units of the same kind and instruct them to go to the same location, and some will randomly take a different route depending on their starting point, which, if there are enemy units nearby, can mean that part of your forces enter combat under-resourced. I also never found a way to set a waypoint for completed unit construction, again resulting in some unusual pathing that cost me units from time to time. This seemed to be more of an issue for sea-based combat, but it did pop up for infantry-based units as well. As I said, it's definitely not game-breaking, but it was a minor annoyance, although I will say it did not really detract from the game's overall fun factor. Now, graphically, the game looks great for a 1997 title. All of the units are nicely detailed, with a variety of landscapes supporting the game's overall map design, with everything from lush green fields to planets of lava. Effects all look great also, with everything from explosions to wildfires suitably animating the screen. Probably the closest title to compare this to graphical-wise would be Age of Empires, which also released in 1997, and I would argue that of the two, discounting the HD remake obviously, that Total Annihilation has aged a little better owing to its more overhead viewpoint as opposed to Age of Empires' more isometric view, which puts a little more focus on some of the more lower fidelity items. Overall, the game still stands up graphically today, and while I can't easily benchmark performance of the day, I don't recall having any issues on my era-appropriate PC in the 90s, although nostalgia could be clouding my vision here. Sound-wise, you're getting an amazing soundtrack which sounds appropriately sci-fi and warlike, helping to amp up the intensity of the battles, combined with some solid sound effects and masterful voice acting for narration. Like with the graphics, what's here is great and has really stood the test of time well. Now, I said at the beginning of the video I don't really like RTSs, and at the risk of a flaming mob coming after me in the comments, outside of a very brief venture into Age of Mythology, Total Annihilation was probably the last real RTS I put any real amount of time into. I've certainly checked out other games over the years, but nothing has really captured my attention to stick with it for any real period. Perhaps I was spoilt with Total Annihilation and its approachability and general fun factor? I don't know, maybe I need to give more RTSs a go until I find another one that sticks with me the same way. I'm not saying that Total Annihilation is the best RTS of all time, but whenever I see people creating those best of lists, Total Annihilation is always in the mix, suggesting that it wasn't just me who had a blast with this old classic. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.